All right, today we're going to unpack a landmark Supreme Court case that, believe it or not, all comes down to a piece of technology most of us have used, an extension phone. We're going to dive into how this one case sparked a huge debate on privacy, technology, and what the words of the law really mean.
So, to really get a grip on this, we're going to follow the classic structure of a legal case digest. We'll start with the facts, nail down the central issue, get to the final ruling, and then, and this is the most important part, we'll really explore the court's reasoning behind it all. Then, we'll wrap up with the legal principle this case created and the final order. Let's get started.
First up, the facts. So how on earth did a simple telephone call manage to escalate all the way to the Supreme Court? Well, it all kicks off on a single morning back in October of 1975.
Okay, so here's the play-by-play. Attorney Pintor calls up Attorney Lacanico to talk about settling a case. Now, Lacanico wants some legal advice on the spot, so he asks his own lawyer, Attorney Gaanan, to just listen in on an extension line. During that call, Pintor allegedly lists off several demands, including a payment. Now, based on what was said, an entrapment operation is quickly put together, and later that day, Pintor is arrested. But then the script completely flips. Pintor turns around and files a complaint against Lacanico and Gaanan for violating the Anti-Wiretapping Act, arguing that Gaanan listened to their private call without his permission. And you know what? The lower courts actually agreed with him, and they convicted both Lacanico and Gaanan.
So that conviction is what brings us to the absolute heart of this legal fight. The entire case, everything, came down to how the court was going to interpret just a few specific words in a law. And here is that central question. Does simply listening in on an extension phone count as illegal wiretapping? You see, the law, Republic Act No. 4200, prohibits tapping a wire or using any device or arrangement to secretly overhear a conversation. The entire fate of Adi Gaanan depended on whether a common, everyday office extension phone could be considered one of those illegal devices.
All right, so we've got the facts, we've got the core legal question. So how did the Supreme Court rule on this? Let's get straight to the verdict.
The court's decision was absolutely clear and decisive. It completely annulled the lower court's decision and acquitted the petitioner, Adi Gaanan. Now, this is where we get to the really good stuff, the legal reasoning that led the court to this acquittal.
This is the why behind it all, the court's reasoning, or what lawyers call the ratio decidendi. And the Supreme Court didn't just pull this out of thin air. It built its argument on several key pillars, from how we interpret laws in the first place, to the actual history of the law itself.
So the court started with a cornerstone of justice. If a criminal law is vague or ambiguous, it absolutely must be interpreted in a way that favors the accused. From there, they looked at the actual text of the law. It lists devices like dictaphones and tape recorders. The court said, look, an extension phone, a standard piece of equipment in any office or home, is in a completely different category. It's not some special gadget installed for the sole purpose of secretly listening in.
The court also brought up this really fascinating idea of assumed risk, and they even cited an American case, Rathbun versus United States, to back it up. The thinking here is pretty straightforward. When you make a phone call, you kind of have to accept the possibility, the risk, that the person on the other end might have an extension phone and might let someone else listen in. It's just a common feature of modern communication.
And this slide really breaks down the core distinction the court was making. On one hand, the Anti-Wiretapping Act is all about stopping active, secret interception, physically tapping a wire or planting a hidden bug. But on the other hand, you have an extension phone, which is just a common, everyday instrument. Its existence isn't a secret, and the court argued that any caller can reasonably assume that one might be in use.
And to really cement their reasoning, the court went back to the source. They looked at the congressional records from when the law was first being debated. This quote from Senator Tañada is so revealing. He makes it clear that the original intent of the lawmakers wasn't just about overhearing. It was about stopping the creation of secret recordings that could be doctored or used as false evidence in court. That focus on recording was a massive factor in the court's final decision.
Now, this decision did way more than just settle this one case. It actually reinforced a critical legal doctrine that helps protect all of us from laws being interpreted too broadly. Let's take a look at the principle it set for the future. So the key doctrine here is called the strict construction of penal statutes. It might sound technical, but the idea is actually pretty simple. If a law has the power to put someone in prison, its language cannot be stretched. Vague phrases like "or any other device or arrangement" have to be interpreted narrowly. In this case, that means the phrase only applies to devices that are similar to the ones listed in the law, things that are actually secret tools for listening and recording, not common items like a phone.
And so, that brings us to the very end of the line.
the final, formal command from the Supreme Court that officially closes the book on this case.
And there you have it, the dispositive portion of the decision. With these powerful words, the Supreme Court formally granted the petition, completely nullified the previous conviction, and officially acquitted attorney Gaanan. The long legal journey that all started with one phone call finally reached its definitive conclusion.
You know, this case from back in 1986 drew a pretty clear line for the technology of that era. But it leaves us with a really compelling question for today. In an age where we have smart speakers in our homes, phones with microphones in our pockets, and constant connectivity, what does assuming the risk of being overheard even mean anymore? It's a question where law, technology, and our right to privacy are continuing to intersect in some really fascinating and challenging ways.